these three true home invasion horror stories are inspired by real events. A lone survivor of a brutal attack forced to watch his family get torn apart. A family's isolated lodge becomes a terrifying prison when a blizzard traps them inside with two violent intruders. And a vacation cabin that becomes a tomb, sparking a decades-long cold case. Make sure you watch until the very end, because in the last story, you'll want to see what catastrophic mistake police made on day one that guaranteed the killer would never face justice. Dr. Anderson's house, a quiet home at the end of a cul-de-sac in a Boston suburb, felt like a tomb. He was on the living room floor, a thick strip of duct tape pulled tight across his mouth, the plastic biting hard into his wrists whenever he tried to move. His world had shrunk to the patch of carpet in front of his eyes and the sounds coming from upstairs. He could hear one of them, a man with a low, steady voice, and then the terrified, high-pitched whimpers of his youngest son, Joseph. A muffled clatter from another room, a choked sob from his wife, Elizabeth. And then a heavy silence fell. That silence was the worst sound of all, and it's what sent his mind reeling backward, escaping to just a few hours before. Hours before, this house had been full of life. He'd been in his favorite armchair, the TV flickering with the green field of a Red Sox game. His oldest, Harrison, was stretched out on the rug, focused on a math problem. The only sound from him, the light scratch of his pencil, lead against paper. Joseph and Elizabeth were in the kitchen, their laughter floating out into the living room. Over it all was the rich smell of a pot roast simmering on the stove, a warm, heavy scent that made the place feel like a real home, a safe place. They had all just sat down to eat when the doorbell chimed. He went to answer it, found the porch empty, and turned back around into a nightmare. Two men stepped out of the shadows. One held a pistol, the other a metal golf club. "Evening, Doctor," the thin one had said, his voice completely flat. "We just need to come in for a minute." It all happened with a horrifying quiet. There was no struggle, just a swift, silent surrender. In less than a minute, they were all on the floor, hands tied, mouths covered. The violation was absolute. The memory was so sharp it was almost real. A brief escape, but a heavy, deliberate footstep from the floor above shattered the image. The thud of that single step pulled Dr. Anderson from the past and slammed him right back to the cold reality of the living room carpet. The muffled sounds from the other rooms had stopped. The men were coming downstairs. Dr. Anderson held his breath, listening to their unhurried descent. He heard the tall one, Miller, talking to his wife. His voice was a low murmur, calm and instructional. Then came the unmistakable rip of tape being pulled away from skin. The man was telling her to get her shoes on, that she was going for a little drive with him. The front door opened and closed. A car started outside, its engine a low rumble that quickly faded down the street. The house became even quieter, a deep, listening kind of quiet. Dr. Anderson was left with the other one, the man with the blank face called Davis. He sat on the couch, the pistol resting on his knee, pointed at nothing. He didn't look at Dr. Anderson. He didn't say a word. He just stared at the far wall with dead eyes, like a man waiting for a train. The only sound in the entire world was the loud, steady tick of the grandfather clock in the hall. Each tick was a hammer blow, marking another second that his family was being torn apart. Dr. Anderson's mind raced, picturing 1,000 horrible things happening out there in the dark. An eternity later, the car returned. He heard it pull into the driveway, heard 2 car doors shut. When Elizabeth and Miller came back inside, the feeling in the house had changed. The strange calm was gone. Now there was a frantic, nervous energy coming off both men. Dr. Anderson could hear them whispering in the kitchen. He heard the metallic clink of silverware being moved around in a drawer, the soft rustle of a plastic bag. Then a new sound began. It was his wife, Elizabeth, weeping. It wasn't loud, just a quiet, desperate, hopeless sound. Miller's voice was different now, too. It was sharp and angry, spitting out short, hard words. Suddenly another sound cut through the night. It was faint at first, then it grew louder, closer. Sirens, a piercing wail that ripped through the suffocating quiet. Davis, the man with the gun, shot up from the couch. His blank expression was finally gone, replaced by a flash of fury. "The alarm!" he growled, his voice low and dangerous. "She tripped the alarm at the bank." Panic exploded in the room. The slow, creeping horror of the night was gone, replaced by a sudden, brutal chaos. Dr. Anderson watched, helpless, as Miller lunged toward his wife. A sickening metallic crack echoed through the house as the golf club struck her. Her body went limp and fell to the floor. A strangled cry came from Harrison, who was tied up in the corner of the room. Joseph, seeing his mother fall, let out a piercing, terrified scream that a child should never have to make. Davis spun around and turned the gun on the boys. 2 gunshots. The sound was deafening in the small house, a final, terrible punctuation mark. The screaming stopped. Miller shouted something, his voice strained. Then a new, sharp smell filled the air. Gasoline. The men were moving fast now, their movements quick and methodical. They were splashing liquid from a can. Dr. Anderson felt the heat begin to rise almost instantly. The thick, oily smell of smoke started to burn his nostrils. This house, his sanctuary, was being turned into a funeral pyre. Through the haze, he saw the small, bright flicker of a lighter, the last evil act in a night of them. Adrenaline surged through Dr. Anderson. He twisted and pulled against his restraints, feeling the plastic cut deeper into his skin. The rope was slick with his own sweat. He pulled, feeling his shoulders scream in protest, and managed to force one hand free. He reached up and ripped the tape from his mouth with a sharp, painful tear. He could hear the hungry crackle of the fire as it began to spread, the greedy pop and snap of the old wooden walls catching fire. He saw the 2 men run for the front door without a backward glance. The sound of their footsteps faded outside, leaving him alone in the burning house. Flames were licking at the doorway to the hall. He crawled, using his legs and his one free hand to drag himself away from the growing fire. Smoke filled his lungs, a hot, searing pain with every breath. He could still hear the sirens, much closer now, a constant wail in the night. He was almost to the front door, the heat like a physical weight on his back. With one last desperate push, he shoved himself over the threshold and collapsed onto the lawn. The grass was cool and wet against his burning skin. He lay there on his lawn, choking, as the first police car and then the fire engine roared up to the curb. He watched his home, his life, get eaten by the inferno. The smoke poured into the night sky, a thick black column marking the spot where a family had once lived. Months later, Dr. Anderson sat in a courtroom. He looked at the 2 men, Davis and Miller, sitting calmly at the defense table. Their faces were the same as they were that night. Impassive, blank, empty. He had told this story 100 times now. He told it to the first cops on the scene, to the detectives in a sterile interrogation room, to the news cameras on his lawn. But this was the last time. He looked at the faces of the jury and he spoke. His voice trembled, but it was firm. He described the sound of his son's laughter from the kitchen. He described the smell of his wife's cooking. He described the simple chime of the doorbell and the flat, dead voice of the man who said he just needed to come in for a minute. He described the long, silent hours of waiting, the muffled sobs from the other room. He described the sickening crack of the club and the final deafening echo of the gunshots. And then he described the smoke, the fire, and the quiet, awful truth of what happened that night. Through it all, the men didn't flinch. They stared straight ahead, as if they were watching a boring movie, as if he wasn't even there. And in that moment, looking at their blank faces, Dr. Anderson understood. The evil didn't announce itself with thunder and shadow. It was quiet. It was ordinary. It was the simple, devastating fact that men like this could exist. Men who could destroy a family and feel nothing at all. He had survived the fire, but the night had left a scar inside him that would never heal. Snowfall. This heavy should have been a good thing. It meant the roads were closed, the world was shut out, and a family was safe inside. But not this time. Not in this house. The only thing moving was the sound from the hallway, the steady tick-tock of an old grandfather clock. It was a sound Dahl had heard his whole life, a rhythm that was supposed to mean everything was okay. But tonight, it sounded like a clock counting down to zero. It was just after midnight, December of 1970. Outside, a mean blizzard had dumped feet of snow across the northern Minnesota wilderness, burying the family's isolated fishing lodge. The wind had screamed like a monster for hours, rattling the windows trying to get in. But now, it was gone. And the dead quiet it left behind was a whole lot scarier. In the living room, a man named Brown walked back and forth. His breath came out in angry, ragged puffs. His partner, Meyer, just stood by the window, staring at the black wall of the night. Meyer had a disturbing calm about him. They'd come here for a reason. They'd heard a rumor that the owner, Dahl, had a strongbox stuffed with cash from the fishing season. $100,000, the rumor said. Enough money to disappear and start over. The strongbox was on the floor, busted open. Inside was just a couple $100. The plan had been simple. Get in, grab the money, get out. The blizzard was supposed to be their cover, a perfect white curtain to hide their tracks. But the storm had turned on them. Now it was a cage. Their truck was just a lump under a snowdrift. A snowmobile in the shed was useless in snow this deep. They were trapped. Their big score was a joke, and the anger coming off Brown felt like heat in the freezing room. A soft whimper cut through the tension. It came from upstairs, a small, scared sob. Brown's head snapped toward the hallway. He'd been so fixated on the money he'd almost forgotten about the people tied up in their beds. Amy and Jen. The panic from the failed job was now mixing with the cold, hard fact of what they'd done. Downstairs in the basement, Dahl and his son Stephen were tied to the water pipes listening. They heard every little sound, the soft creak of floorboards above them, the hiss of a propane lantern being lit, the low, angry mumble of the men's voices. Dahl had told them where the box was. He'd told them everything they wanted to know, hoping that would be enough to save his family. But finding out the box was empty had changed the whole game. The quiet that followed was the sound of a verdict being decided. Dahl's family wasn't used to strangers. They lived a quiet life, surrounded by the tough, lonely beauty of the woods. They took care of themselves. Dahl ran the lodge. Amy ran their little store. 14-year-old Stephen was good with his hands, always fixing the snowmobile or the radio out in the shed. 13-year-old Jen was the life of the place, her laugh echoing through the quiet pines. They had built a safe, predictable world for themselves, protected by the same wilderness that now had them trapped. Brown later told the cops he was disappointed. That's not the right word. Disappointment is soft. This was the feeling of your last chance, your one big dream, turning to dust in your hands. Brown paced and paced, the sound of his heavy boots on the wood floorboards, muttering to himself. The failure was a lit fuse, and it was burning down fast. In the basement, Dahl pulled at the ropes around his wrists. He could hear his son's breathing, quick and shaky, next to him. A sudden, sharp noise from upstairs made them both flinch. The sound of a bedroom door being pulled open hard, followed by heavy footsteps. Then, a new sound. The slow, deliberate groan of the basement stairs. Creak, 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 one step at a time. This wasn't Brown. Brown was the talker, the nervous one. This was the quiet one, Meyer, the man who had barely said 5 words the whole time. Meyer had seemed almost bored before, but there was a purpose in his walk now, a job to be finished. The footsteps hit the concrete floor of the basement. A bright beam from a flashlight sliced through the dark. It jumped around the damp walls before it found Dahl's face and stayed there. The light was a cold, steady white, and it didn't waver. It made the shadows of the pipes on the wall look like long, crooked fingers. Meyer's eyes were calm, almost blank. He knelt down, keeping the bright light locked on Dahl. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. His silence was louder than any threat. Dahl tried to say something, to plead, but his throat was clamped shut with fear. The last thing Dahl saw was the calm, empty face of a man looking at him like he was a piece of broken furniture. The last thing he heard was the soft, mechanical click of a pistol's hammer being pulled back. It was the final sound in the house, besides the steady, uncaring tick-tock of the old clock upstairs. Days later, a neighbor came by on his snowmobile. He hadn't heard from the family on the radio, which was strange. He saw the lodge, still and dark, half buried in a wall of white snow. He knocked, but the sound was swallowed by the silence. He pushed on the door and it swung open with a sigh. The air that came out was freezing, and it carried a strange, metallic smell. The investigation, led by Sheriff Ricks, was slow. The snow had covered everything, leaving him with a mystery as cold as the ground he stood on. No tracks, no prints, just a gut feeling. The only lead was a rumor about 2 strangers seen in a stolen truck before the storm hit. The case went cold, buried under all that white. But Sheriff Ricks was a patient man. He knew these woods and the quiet people who lived in them. This wasn't just a job for him. For months, the Dahl case file sat on his desk, a constant reminder. The break finally came from a man who'd worked on a ranch with Brown. The man felt guilty. He'd heard Brown bragging about a big score up north. He gave the sheriff a name. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Sheriff Ricks and his team followed that thin thread. A gas receipt with a fake name. A stolen license plate spotted hundreds of miles away. A grainy image from a truck stop security camera. Piece by piece, they put together the trail of 2 men running from a ghost. They finally caught them in a sunny, warm state, a world away from the frozen Minnesota woods. In the interrogation room, they turned on each other. Brown swore it was all Meyer, but it was Meyer who told them exactly what happened, in a flat, clinical voice. He didn't seem sorry. He just laid out the facts. He said the real reason wasn't the robbery. It was the rage, the fury of risking everything, their entire lives for a couple of $100. The violence wasn't for money. It was for the failure. Sheriff Ricks never forgot his last time at the lodge. He stood on the frozen lake out front, looking at the silent house. The ice and the isolation the family loved, the things that made them feel safe, had become their tomb. The wind was quiet. The only sound was the crunch of his boots in the snow. The beautiful, quiet wilderness now held the memory of an ugly, senseless act. The family was now a part of that deep, permanent silence. The forest was holding a deep silence. High-altitude air is thin and sharp, the kind that makes a man's lungs ache with every breath. David's breath puffed out in white clouds. Beside him, his friend Kevin's boots made a steady, crunching sound on the thick carpet of pine needles. But that was the only sound. There were no birds calling, no squirrels chattering in the branches. The wind itself was still. It wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was an absolute deadness, the kind of silence that makes your ears strain to hear something, anything at all. Up ahead, the dark shape of an A-frame cabin slowly separated itself from the trees. Cabin 17. And all the lights were still off. Just a few hours ago, the world had been full of noise. David and his friend Chris were at the local arcade, surrounded by the electronic symphony of dozens of games, the clatter of skee-ball, and the laughter of other kids on vacation. It was normal. It was loud. When they got back around 1 in the morning, David had seen a shadow flicker inside the cabin. He saw Chris's shoes lying just inside the door and figured that was that. His mom was angry they were out so late. Rather than face her, he'd decided to crash on the couch at Kevin's cabin nearby with Kevin and his friend Kyle. It was easier than getting an earful. But now, with the pale morning light filtering down through the tall pines, that easy decision felt like a terrible mistake. The memory of the arcade's noise made the woods feel even quieter, unnaturally so. This whole vacation had felt off from the start. His mom, Brenda, was always on edge. The rental cabin was deep in the woods, set back on a lonely road, and she was convinced she was being watched. The men in the next cabin, Mark and Jerry, were the cause. They were always outside, working on an old, rusty truck, their movements slow and deliberate. Brenda said Mark had a way of looking at her, of trying to start conversations that went nowhere, that made her skin crawl. She made sure to keep her distance, always locking the flimsy cabin door. The big glass windows of cabin 17 made her feel exposed, like they were living in a fishbowl for anyone to peer into. As David and Kevin got closer, the cabin looked less like a vacation spot and more like a trap somebody had forgotten to spring. The front door was ajar, a dark vertical slice of shadow in the morning light. An invitation that felt like a warning. David felt his stomach clench up. He shoved the door open. The hinges let out a long, groaning shriek that cut through the silent woods like a scream. The air that rolled out from inside was stale and thick. It smelled of pine cleaner and something else underneath it, something sharp and metallic, like old pennies. The inside was a wreck. A kitchen chair was on its side, one of its legs splintered. A lamp lay on the floor near the wall, its shade crushed like a paper cup. In the dim light, David could see dust motes dancing in the air, illuminated by the sliver of morning sun coming through the door. His first thought was a break-in. Someone had stolen their stuff. Then, a low moan came from the other room. It was a sound of pure misery, and it pulled David forward. He and Kevin moved toward the sound, their boots suddenly feeling loud and clumsy on the wooden floor. They stepped into the main living space, and the world seemed to tilt and go quiet. His eyes had to adjust to the gloom, and the scene came into focus piece by piece. First, he saw a shape on the floor. It was his mom. Brenda was lying on her side facing away from him. Then he saw the bindings, shiny gray duct tape around her wrists and ankles, and black electrical cords wrapped around her body. Her face was bruised and swollen. Her breathing was a shallow, hitching thing, and she was whimpering through the tape that covered her mouth, tears making clean tracks through the grime on her cheeks. For a second, David's mind just refused to understand what he was seeing. Then his eyes darted from his mother and looked toward the hallway. There was another dark shape on the floor. It was Chris. He was completely still, lying at an angle that was deeply unnatural. David's eyes caught the glint of metal on the carpet nearby, a simple steak knife from their kitchen block, and a heavy, greasy tire jack handle. Chris's shoes, the same shoes David had seen through the door last night, were tossed a few feet from his body. The sight of them, so ordinary and out of place, somehow made the whole scene even more horrible. The breath caught in David's throat. His mind scrambled, trying to make sense of the scene. The overturned chair, the broken lamp, his mother tied on the floor, Chris's awful stillness. Then a new, sharper horror hit him. A question that screamed through his shock. His sister, Tammy, wasn't there. Where was Tammy? His legs felt unsteady, like they might give out. Kevin was saying his name, his voice urgent, but the sound was distant and muffled, like it was coming from underwater. David fumbled for his phone, his fingers slick and clumsy. He dialed 911. His voice was a broken, shaking thing as he tried to explain the impossible sight in front of him. It felt like an eternity before the sound of sirens finally broke the forest's silence. 2 patrol cars from the Big Bear Sheriff's Department crunched to a stop on the gravel outside. A few deputies got out, their faces set and serious as they walked into the cabin. They were grim, but they were also unprepared. They walked through the scene, their heavy boots tracking dirt and leaves across the floor, stepping through whatever evidence was there. David tried to speak, to tell them about the neighbors, about his mom's fear, but they just put a hand up and told him to wait outside. The crackle of their radios was harsh and loud in the awful quiet of the room. Every step they took, every item they touched without gloves, was a piece of the story being erased forever. This was a small-town department, and a crime of this brutality was something they had never seen. They were out of their depth, and justice was already slipping away. The investigation was a disaster from the start. They failed to properly secure the scene, and it was quickly contaminated. The murder weapons, the tire jack handle, and the steak knife were the most critical pieces of evidence. They were collected, but somehow, during the transfer to a more advanced crime lab, they were lost. A catastrophic, unforgivable mistake. Any chance of pulling fingerprints or DNA from them vanished completely. The focus naturally fell on the 2 neighbors, Mark and Jerry. During questioning, Kevin and Kyle told the deputies they'd seen a man who looked just like Mark moving around the cabin on the night of the attack. But they were just kids, scared and confused, and their story was shaky enough for the investigators to dismiss. Mark did something strange, though. He left a rambling, bizarre note for Brenda, trying to pin the whole thing on Jerry. It was filled with paranoid language and what sounded like hints of guilt, but the deputies couldn't make sense of it. They wrote it off as the ravings of a troubled man. A few days after that, Jerry disappeared. He vanished without a word to anyone, a move that seemed like a clear admission of guilt. But with no real evidence to hold him, there was nothing the police could do. Weeks crawled by. The search for Tammy went on. Her face was on flyers tacked to telephone poles and in the windows of every store in town. Then a hiker found her body, miles away from the cabin in a remote, quiet part of the forest. The final awful piece of the puzzle fell into place. Decades passed. The case of Cabin 17 went cold, becoming a dark local legend, a ghost story whispered among the residents of the quiet mountain town. Mark died of natural causes, and it seemed like any chance of finding the truth died with him. But some stories don't stay buried. In the 2010s, new DNA technology gave the case a flicker of life. a team of cold case investigators reopened the file. The original evidence was almost entirely gone, lost or contaminated by the initial flawed police work. All they had left were the strips of duct tape and the electrical cord that had been used to bind Brenda. It wasn't much, but they hoped it was enough. In a shocking turn, a new piece of evidence, possibly a knife sheath forgotten for decades, was even discovered near the original crime scene. For a moment, it seemed like an answer was finally within reach. The identity of the killer was likely confirmed through these new tests. But it was too late. Because of the botched investigation in 1985, because of the lost evidence and the contaminated scene, a prosecutor could never build a strong enough case to take to trial. Justice was never served. The mystery of Cabin 17 remains unsolved, a permanent stain on the quiet California mountains. It's a story that proves that the deepest horror isn't always the crime itself, but the suffocating silence that follows when justice is denied, leaving a family's final terrible moments trapped forever in the cold, unyielding woods.